The day was turning into evening, and the streets of Los Angeles were slowly sinking into a soft orange glow. The wind, cool and light, stirred the tops of the palm trees, carrying with it a fresh breeze from the coast. Nick sat behind the wheel of his black Escalade, taking his time as he made his way back to his home in the Brentwood Hills. The house that once felt like a fortress, a symbol of his and Tara's life together, now only reminded him of the invisible but growing crack in their relationship. The radio played quietly in the car, some old rock hit, but Nick wasn't listening. His thoughts wandered far away. He remembered the moment when he and Tara had first met at one of those Hollywood parties, back when she was at the height of her career. Everything seemed perfect. She a bright, charismatic, beautiful star, and he a successful musician who had dreamed of playing on big stages since childhood. Their union felt like something out of a rom-com, the kind of ideal marriage tabloids wrote about. But that was then. In the last few months, he found himself increasingly feeling like he didn't recognize his wife anymore. Her endless tours, shoots, and constant parties and social events had distanced her from him. They rarely sought each other, and even when they spent time together, it was as if there was an invisible wall between them that neither dared to break. The car rolled gently up to the gates of their house, and Nick slowed down. Tara was home. The lights were on, and music coming from inside was audible even on the driveway. He didn't recognize the song, but it was some hit currently playing on the radio. He pulled his phone from his jacket pocket, and a message from his manager flashed on the screen, reminding him of upcoming negotiations with Columbia Records. Without reading it, Nick switched off the screen and put the phone away. Work, like so many other things, had taken a back seat. Right now, what worried him most was what was happening behind the doors of his own home. He parked the car and slowly stepped out, savoring the last rays of sunlight playing on the hood. The night promised to be calm, though something in the air felt unsettling. He stood by the car, listening to the sounds of the evening city, as if trying to gather strength before entering the house. It was a strange feeling because just a few months ago, he would have gladly thrown open the doors, eager to see Tara, to share his thoughts and news with her. But now something was wrong. That feeling was becoming more frequent. Even his favorite chair, which had always been a symbol of comfort and home, no longer brought him peace. When he opened the door and stepped inside, the music grew louder. Nick walked down the hallway without taking off his shoes, which was unusual for him. The floor was cold under his feet, and the house, despite the lights and music, felt oddly empty. He headed for the living room, where his favorite chair always stood, a unique piece by master craftsman Sam Malouf, bought by his father over 20 years ago. That chair had been his father's pride and the most valuable thing he left Nick after his death. It stood there in the corner of the living room like a monument to the past, reminding him of what truly mattered in life. Nick tossed his jacket over the back of a chair, opened a beer bottle, and was just about to sit down when his eyes fell on the scene unfolding in front of him. Tara, his wife, was sitting in that very chair, but she wasn't alone. With her was Carl, his old friend, a bandmate. They were both undressed, absorbed in an act that Nick initially couldn't even comprehend. His heart stopped. Everything that had once been important to him, this chair, his wife, his friend, had now merged into one terrible kaleidoscope. He stood still. Time seemed to freeze. Thoughts raced through his mind. Why Carl? Why Tara? And simultaneously, absurdly he thought, if they break the chair, I won't survive it. That thought was so ridiculous that he felt his lips twitch as if on the verge of breaking into laughter. Several long seconds passed before Carl finally noticed him. He jumped up, fumbling the dress, tripping over his own clothes. Tara also stood, covering herself with a sweater she found nearby. They both looked embarrassed and confused, but Nick stood motionless, like a marble statue. At that moment, he realized that even if he lashed out at them now, it wouldn't change anything. Everything that had once mattered to him was already destroyed. Tara, Nick heard her whisper, struggling to find words. But what could she possibly say? That they hadn't meant for this to happen. That it was a mistake. All those words seemed meaningless in light of what Nick had just seen. He didn't say a word. He simply turned and left the room, heading toward the bedroom. Halfway there, he stopped and looked at himself in the mirror. Had he ever seen himself like this? Exhaustion, mixed with pain and betrayal, filled his reflection. Tara approached him from behind, her eyes full of tears. "Where are you going?" she asked, trying to sound confident, though her voice betrayed her panic. "Anywhere but here," Nick replied, gathering clothes into a bag. He was surprised at how calm he felt in that moment. His voice didn't waver, his hands didn't shake. It was like the shock had given way to a calm resolve. His mind had already started planning what to do next, how to move forward with a life that no longer had room for Tara. "We didn't mean," she began, but Nick raised a hand to stop her. "I don't want to hear it," he said coldly, zipping up the bag. "You could have warned me, let me know things weren't right. But you chose this, and now I don't care." He walked out of the bedroom, leaving Tara sitting on the edge of the bed, lost in her thoughts. Nick made his way back to the living room, where Carl was hurriedly gathering his things. Carl wanted to say something, to apologize, but Nick didn't give him the chance. "I just need the chair," Nick said, grabbing it and heading for the door. He took the chair, that symbol of family values, and loaded it into the car along with a couple of guitars, not looking back at the house that was now just an empty shell to him. As he got into the car and started the engine, Carl stood on the porch, trying to explain something, but Nick was no longer listening. He turned up the music and drove away, heading anywhere as long as it was far from the place where his life had collapsed. Those few minutes had changed everything. Nick drove through the night streets of Los Angeles, barely paying attention to the road or the traffic lights. The only thing spinning in his mind was the scene he had walked in on at home. Carl, his old friend, Tara, his wife, and his beloved chair now a witness to their betrayal. His fingers gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white, but there was no anger inside him. It was something else, cold and hollowing. He felt his heart sinking into a pit of despair, but instead of wanting to scream, break something, or lash out, he felt nothing but indifference. The car smoothly glided along the highway, the city lights flashing by, but none of it mattered. Even when his phone buzzed in his pocket, likely John, the band's guitarist, or the manager worried about the upcoming negotiations with the label. He ignored the call. Not now. Nothing mattered right now. He drove for miles along the empty freeway, not thinking about his destination. It seemed that everything in his life had lost meaning the moment he saw Tara with Carl. What had once felt unshakable, their love, their marriage, their shared dreams, now felt like a cruel joke of fate. He thought about how long it had been going on, how many times Tara and Carl had betrayed him while he remained oblivious. Nick wasn't a fool. He'd sensed that something had changed between him and Tara, but he tried to dismiss it, blaming their busy work schedules, their different lives. But now he knew his peace had been nothing more than self-deception. After hours of driving, Nick realized that running away wasn't going to solve anything. Something had to be done, some decision made. Pulling over to the side of the road, he glanced at his phone again. Several missed calls from John and from Tara. Tara had called the most, her name kept flashing over and over. Finally, he decided to answer. "Nick?" Her voice was weak, filled with tears. "Where are you? We need to talk. I'll explain everything." He closed his eyes, listening to her voice. Once, he would have given anything to hear it after a long day on tour. But now that voice was only full of lies and empty promises. "What is there to explain?" he asked, knowing there wasn't an answer that could satisfy him. "It was a mistake," she began, but Nick cut her off. "A mistake? That's what you're calling it? How long has this been going on, Tara?" His voice was sharp, but there was no anger, only cold disappointment. Silence on the other end. Nick heard her take a heavy breath. "A few months," she admitted quietly, and Nick felt his heart tighten. A few months. All this time she had been lying to him, living a double life. "Why Carl?" he asked. That was the question he wanted answered most of all. Why his friend, the person he trusted? Tara was silent for a long time before she replied. "I don't know. It just happened by accident. Her voice was filled with regret. I can't explain it. It just happened. Nick let out a bitter laugh, though nothing about this was funny. It just happened. Just like that? He repeated. You couldn't at least come up with a better excuse. I'm not trying to make excuses, she snapped, her voice becoming tense. I know it was wrong. I know I betrayed you. But, Nick, you haven't been the same person I fell in love with. You've changed. Those words hit him hard. Changed. Maybe she was right. Maybe it was his fault. Over the years, they had both changed. The music, the tours, the success, it had all pulled him into its vortex. But he wasn't ready to hear that their relationship no longer mattered to her. So, this is my fault, he asked quietly, trying to keep his emotions in check. I'm not saying it's just your fault, Tara replied, her voice softening again. We're both to blame. We drifted apart. We stopped being close. I felt alone. Alone. That word struck a chord. He had felt alone too, but he had never sought comfort elsewhere. Alone? Tara, if you felt alone, you could have talked to me. We could have worked something out. But instead, you chose to sleep with my friend. That's your solution to loneliness? She was silent again. Nick could hear her uneven breathing and knew she was crying. I'm sorry, she whispered, but those words no longer meant anything. I'm packing my things, he said calmly. I'm leaving. Nick, wait. We can fix this, she cried, her voice trembling with fear. We? He asked bitterly. There is no we anymore, Tara. He hung up the phone and tossed it onto the passenger seat. Nothing that had been said mattered anymore. She had tried to justify herself, but nothing could change the fact that she had betrayed him. For him, there was no going back. He turned the car onto the highway, heading north. Brentwood was left behind. Nick had been driving aimlessly for hours when he finally decided to stop at a gas station somewhere on the outskirts of Los Angeles. He didn't know where he was headed, and to be honest, he didn't care. All he needed right now was silence and time to process everything that had happened. He couldn't bring himself to go back home. Home was now a foreign place, filled with memories that had become too painful. Tara, their life, their friendship with Carl, it all felt like a shattered picture, one he could no longer piece back together. The gas station was deserted. The only sounds were the buzzing of fluorescent lights and the distant hum of cars speeding down the nearby highway. Nick walked into the small convenience store, grabbed a bottle of water and a bag of chips. He wasn't hungry, but he took something off the shelf anyway, just to distract himself. The cashier, a sleepy-looking young guy, barely glanced at him as he rang up the purchase. When Nick got back to his car, he noticed his phone buzzing again. More missed calls, of course, from Tara. Plus one message from John, the band's guitarist. He opened it. Hey, Nick, where are you? Everyone's waiting. We need to make a decision about the contract. Columbia is pushing hard. If you don't show up, we could lose the deal. Are you okay? Call me. Nick sighed heavily. The band, the contract, the label, it all suddenly felt trivial compared to what had just happened. But he knew he couldn't just walk away and abandon everything. The band was his life. Even though it didn't bring him the joy it once had, he was still tied to these people, to the music, to what they had built together over the years. He thought about the contract John had mentioned. The last few weeks had been intense. Columbia Records wanted to sign them to a multi-million-dollar deal for 5 albums, but the label had concerns about their future. The band was popular, but their recent work hadn't been as successful as their earlier albums. The label doubted whether they could keep producing hits, and negotiations had been tough. Carl, as the band's key songwriter, was supposed to help them climb back to the top. But now, after everything that had happened, Nick couldn't even imagine how they could work together. How could they stand on the same stage, create music, with this chasm of betrayal between them? It seemed impossible. Nick opened his phone again and looked at the messages from Tara. Her words were full of desperation. Nick, please don't leave. We can fix this. I know I've made mistakes, but I love you. Give us a chance. I know you're angry, But that's not a reason to destroy everything. We can talk. You're right. I'm to blame. But that doesn't mean it has to end like this. Those messages no longer caused him pain. They felt empty, like echoes from a past that no longer mattered. Nick knew he had already made his decision. Their marriage was dead. All that was left was to make it official. He leaned back in his seat, closed his eyes, and tried not to think about Tara, Carl, or the band. A memory suddenly surfaced from when he and Tara had first started dating. It was so long ago, when they were still young, full of energy and dreams. Tara had been an up-and-coming star back then, and he had just signed his first record deal. They were the couple everyone talked about. The tabloids loved them. Fans were in awe of their love. Back then, everything had felt so real. But now all of that seemed like an illusion, something that no longer existed. Nick started the car again and drove off. He didn't know where the road was leading him, but he couldn't stay in one place. The car glided smoothly along the highway, and slowly the tension within him began to ease. He decided that the first thing he needed to do was get away, somewhere far, where he could clear his head, think everything through without the pressure and noise of the city. A few hours later, he was far from Los Angeles, heading toward the northern coast. The city lights had faded, giving way to the dark night sky and the occasional distant glow from scattered towns. Up ahead, he saw a small motel, where he decided to stop for the night. The modest, almost deserted building seemed fitting. A quiet, lonely place, like an island in the stormy sea of his thoughts. Nick parked the car and walked toward the reception. Inside, it was quiet. An elderly woman behind the desk looked up from her newspaper to hand him the keys. She didn't even ask for his name, just scribbled the room number on a slip of paper and wished him a good night. The room was simple: a bed, an old TV, and a small window with a view of the highway. Nick sank onto the bed, feeling the exhaustion creeping in. He turned on the TV, hoping for a distraction. But the news about some celebrity scandals only deepened his sense of emptiness. In a world full of deceit and intrigue, his own problems felt like just another act in the grand drama. He turned the TV off and lay back, staring at the ceiling. Sleep wouldn't come. His mind kept circling the same questions. What comes next? Could he leave all of this behind? How does one rebuild a life when everything they thought was theirs has been shattered? These questions seemed unanswerable, but one thing he knew for certain: he had to start over, leaving Tara and everything connected to her behind. Morning at the motel came unexpectedly. Nick woke up to the rays of the sun peeking through the poorly covered windows. It took him a few seconds to realize where he was. The unfamiliar silence, the absence of city noise, and the old fan humming steadily under the ceiling. All this was different from the familiar surroundings of his home in Brentwood. Just yesterday, he was surrounded by familiar things: the armchair, the music, the scents. And now he faced emptiness, and perhaps it was for the better. Nick slowly got out of bed, his body feeling heavy, as if soaked with the very fatigue he felt inside. He walked to the window and looked out at the empty highway, which seemed to lead him nowhere. A lot had changed in the last few hours, but even more changes were yet to come. The phone on the bedside table vibrated again. He glanced at the screen. John, his guitarist, Carl, and the others had probably already noticed his disappearance and absence from the important negotiations. Nick wasn't sure if he was ready to talk to them now, especially after what he found out yesterday. He knew he would have to do it sooner or later, but he was still too drained inside. He picked up the phone anyway. "Nick? Where the hell are you?" John's voice was loud, filled with a mix of concern and irritation. "We're all at the studio. Columbia is pressing us. Carl is here. You need to come." The mention of Carl's name felt like a punch. Nick felt something boiling inside, but he tried to stay calm. "I don't think I can come right now," he said slowly, choosing his words carefully. "I need time." "Time? We don't have time." John was on the verge of panic. "The label demands everyone be here. They're ready to sign the deal, but if you're not here, it could all fall apart. Do you understand that?" Nick listened silently. On one hand, the band was important to him. It was his life, his career, his path. But on the other hand, the thought of Carl sitting in the studio discussing their future was unbearable. "I know you're mad at Carl," John continued, his voice softer. "But you need to think about us. It's not just you and Carl. We all depend on this. If you don't come, everything will collapse." Nick sighed heavily, feeling the inner conflict growing. He knew John was right. They were a team, and he had no right to jeopardize their future because of his personal feelings. But how could he return to the studio, look Carl in the eye, work with him, knowing what had happened? It seemed impossible. "Okay," he finally answered, feeling the weight of the decision. "I'll come. But it doesn't mean things will be like they were." "Thank you, Nick." John sighed with relief. "We'll get through this. Just come." Nick hung up and sat on the edge of the bed, burying his face in his hands. He knew returning to the studio wouldn't solve his personal problems, but it was a step forward. Work had always been his salvation, and maybe music would help him cope with what was happening inside. After a quick shower and a morning coffee at a roadside diner, Nick got back into his car. The drive back seemed long, but there was a strange magic in it. He still felt the weight of everything that had happened in the last 24 hours, but now he needed to make a decision: how to live from now on. Return to his old life, pretending nothing happened, or start anew? On the way to the studio, he thought about Tara. Her last words echoed in his mind: "We can fix everything." But could he forgive her? He knew that their relationship had gone wrong long before the betrayal, maybe even when they first started living together. From the beginning, their marriage was under the scrutiny of the public and the press. Tara was a famous actress, and he was a successful musician. Everyone loved them as a couple, but no one knew that behind the glittering facade there were unresolved conflicts, unspoken words, and disappointments. Nick realized that he couldn't bring back what was already broken. Even if he tried, nothing would be the same, and he wasn't sure if he wanted to go back. Passing the city noise, Nick parked his car at the studio and sat behind the wheel for a few minutes, hesitating to get out. It seemed that as soon as he walked inside, his life would be back in the same whirlpool. Negotiations, contracts, recordings, and with that, Carl would return, along with a reminder that the people closest to him had betrayed him. He took a deep breath, opened the door, and stepped out of the car. The sun was high, flooding the parking lot with its bright light, but Nick felt cloudy inside. Taking a few steps towards the studio doors, he stopped and looked up at the building. This place had always been sacred to him, where music was born, where their best work was created. But now the building seemed empty and cold. He opened the door and walked in. Familiar faces were in the studio: John, the manager, and of course, Carl. Nick barely glanced at him, trying not to meet his eyes. Carl stood by the microphone, nervously plucking at a guitar string, and when Nick walked in, he took a step back, as if feeling his presence. "Glad you came," John said quietly, approaching him. He was grateful, but his voice was anxious. "We need to discuss the contract. Columbia is ready to sign, but we need to finalize the new terms." Nick nodded, although it all seemed distant and unimportant to him. He glanced at Carl, who, feeling his gaze, lowered his eyes. The tension in the room became almost tangible. "Can we talk?" Carl unexpectedly asked, finally mustering the courage. His voice was weak, but there was genuine guilt in it. Nick looked at him for a long time, not knowing what to say. He wanted to just walk away, but he knew the conversation was inevitable. "All right," he nodded, feeling something click inside. This was a turning point that had to happen. Nick stepped into the small break room without looking back to see if Carl was following him. He knew Carl would follow. This conversation was inevitable. Once inside, Nick stopped by the window, staring out at the street. He heard the door close quietly behind him, and Carl stood at the threshold, seemingly hesitant to come closer. "Nick?" Carl began, but Nick cut him off. "Don't," he said sharply, not turning his head. "Just tell me one thing. How long has this been going on?" The silence that followed felt like an eternity. Nick heard Carl sigh heavily, but he didn't hurry to answer. A few months, Carl finally admitted, and Nick felt his fingers clench into fists. A few months. All this time, they had been lying to him. Nick turned abruptly and looked at Carl. There was no more rage in his eyes, only disappointment and bitterness. "Why you?" he asked, staring directly at his old friend. "Why, Carl? You were my friend. I trusted you more than anyone." Carl lowered his head, unable to meet his gaze. "I don't know," he replied dully. "It wasn't supposed to happen. It just happened. We were together at a party, had some drinks, and," he hesitated, realizing how absurd it sounded. "It was a mistake, and I understand it shouldn't have happened. But then, it continued. I couldn't stop. We couldn't stop." Nick closed his eyes, feeling a wave of pain wash over him. Carl's words were like a blade cutting deep. Couldn't stop. Those words echoed in his mind, and the more he thought about it, the clearer it became that no excuses could erase the betrayal. "Did you understand that this would destroy everything we had?" Nick asked. "Did you ever think about that, even for a minute?" Carl took a step forward, his voice trembling. "Nick, I was a fool," he said, his eyes filled with pain. "I know I deserve everything you can say to me and more. I made a terrible mistake, and I understand it changed everything between us. But damn it, I don't want to lose you. Not just as a friend, but as part of the band. We built this band together, we've been through so much together. I can't just watch it all fall apart." Nick turned away from him, looking out the window again. Carl was right. They had created something great together, something that was part of both of them. But could he forgive? Could he move on, knowing that their friendship was shattered by this betrayal? "I don't know if I can forgive you," Nick said quietly, his voice full of bitterness. "All I feel right now is emptiness. I don't know how to go back to what we had." Carl took another step, his voice even softer. "I know," he admitted, "and I'm not asking for forgiveness. I understand what I did, and I know it probably can't be fixed. But we need to talk about it. If not for us, then at least for the band." "The band?" Nick turned sharply. "You think the band can continue after you betrayed me? How are we supposed to stand on the same stage? How are we supposed to play together when every time I see you, I'll remember what you did?" Carl fell silent, not knowing what to say. Everything he could say seemed insufficient. No words could fix what had happened, but he understood that Nick needed time, and perhaps his only chance at redemption was to let that time pass. "We can try," Carl said quietly, as if afraid that these words might break everything even more. "I'm not asking you to forgive me now or ever, but I want to at least try to keep what we have in the band. Give me a chance." Nick turned away again, feeling the emotions raging inside him. He understood that the band was not just about him and Carl. It was also about John and the other guys who were like family to him. They would suffer too if he decided to cut all ties. But could he just close his eyes to the betrayal? He took a deep breath and exhaled slowly, trying to find the answers. "All right," he finally said. "We'll talk to the guys, but this doesn't mean I can forgive you. And it doesn't mean things will be like they were." Carl nodded, though disappointment was evident in his eyes. He knew this was the most he could hope for. After the tense conversation with Carl, Nick left the break room, feeling the weight of a leaden cloud pressing on his shoulders. Familiar faces greeted him in the studio. John, Vince, and the other band members, all with tense expressions. Nick knew a serious conversation was coming, and every second spent pondering only brought closer the moment when a decision had to be made. It wasn't just about his personal feelings. It was about the future of the entire band. "Well, is everything okay?" John asked cautiously, looking at Nick with concern. Nick shook his head, not even trying to hide his exhaustion. He knew everyone was expecting clarity from him, but he himself was far from it. "I don't know," he answered honestly, his shoulders sagging. "I can't say everything will be the same as before." He sat down on one of the sofas in the studio, leaning on his knees. His gaze was fixed on the floor as he tried to gather his thoughts. John sat next to him, clearly not knowing what to say. The silence lasted several minutes until Vince and the others began asking questions. "Nick," Vince started, carefully choosing his words. "We understand what happened between you and Carl, and it's terrible that you feel betrayed. But what about the band? We can't just abandon everything." Nick looked up at Vince, staring directly into his eyes. He understood that the band wasn't just his personal story. It was their collective effort, their work, their dreams. Everything they had created over the years mattered not just to him, but to everyone else too. If he left, it would not only destroy his relationship with Carl, but also jeopardize the future of everyone who worked with them. "I'm not going to abandon everything," Nick finally said firmly. "I'm still here and I'm still part of this band. But I'm not sure how long I can continue. Too much has happened. I don't know if I can ever feel the same way again." John nodded silently, accepting his words. He understood it was a difficult decision and didn't push Nick. Nick felt this was a moment of truth for all of them. "All right," John said, finally standing up. "Let's try to focus on the music. That's why we're all here." Music had always been their salvation. When there were no words or decisions, there was always music that could express everything they felt. And although Nick didn't know if he could ever look at Carl the same way again, he understood that music was the one thing that bound them all together. "I don't know if I can work with Carl," Nick said, looking directly at his former friend. "But I'll try. For the band, for all of us." Carl remained silent, but it was clear that Nick's statement hurt him deeply. He understood that nothing would ever be the same and that forgiveness might never come. But the fact that Nick was at least willing to try seemed like a small miracle to him. "Thank you," Carl said quietly, unable to lift his eyes. Several weeks passed since that day, and the band gathered in the studio again. Nick felt like a stranger in this space, though he didn't show it. Every time they played, his thoughts returned to the betrayal, and although he tried to focus on the music, the wound was still fresh. But they moved forward. The music continued, songs were created one after another, and despite the tense atmosphere, the band slowly began to regain its sound. One evening after a long day in the studio, Nick sat alone, holding his acoustic guitar. He strummed the strings, playing a melody that had been spinning in his head for days. It was something new, something deep, reflecting everything he had felt recently. John, passing by, heard the melody and stopped. "Is that something new?" he asked, sitting down next to him. Nick nodded, continuing to play. "Yeah," he answered quietly, "a song about forgiveness, or about how hard it is to find." John nodded, understanding that Nick was expressing through music what words couldn't convey. "Maybe it's what we all need," John said, "music that helps us get through this." "Maybe," Nick agreed. "But, forgiveness is a tricky thing. I'm not sure I can forgive Carl. But maybe this song will help me find some peace." They sat in silence, listening to the sounds of the guitar filling the studio. It was a moment of understanding, a moment of realizing that music had always been their salvation. Even when everything else fell apart, it helped them find common ground. Several months later, the band released a new album. It was filled with emotions, pain, and forgiveness. It was their most personal work to date, and although the relationship between Nick and Carl never returned to its previous state, they managed to work together, creating music that became a new chapter in their lives. Tara left Nick's life forever. The divorce was quick, without headlines and public fights. Nick left behind everything that connected him to her, deciding to start anew. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing: he had music, and it would never betray him. On a warm summer evening, as the sun was setting, Nick sat on the terrace of his new house in a small town in Northern California. He held his guitar, playing the same melody. It was no longer a song about pain. Now it was a song about a new beginning. He closed his eyes and immersed himself in the sound, feeling how each chord washed away past hurts and brought something new: hope.